friends with Dorothy, fighting for your civil rights. Out on the cruel streets tonight. For Sylvia and Marcia, life was harder than you'll ever know. Still they placed a star where others just threw a stone. Ignited, 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 yeah.
I'm joined this morning by the author, Dr. Patrick McDonagh, and Patrick has written an awesome book called Gay and Lesbian Activism in the Republic of Ireland, 1973 to 1993. Patrick, you've got to be congratulated on this book. It is a really important work, and it's a really important addition to the canon of what we would call LGBTQ+ literature. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Listen, it's great to have an opportunity to talk to you about the book and just to tell your listeners a little bit more about it. So thanks very much for bringing me on.
Patrick, to put it in context, this, I gather, largely consisted of your PhD thesis. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. It's kind of a shortened version of the PhD thesis. Yeah.
Yeah, just, and I'm not being critical here, just in case I've missed anything, the only thing that confused me, at the very beginning, it talks about the plates, which I presume were going to be photographs. I couldn't find them. Is that an omission, or was it, I'm sure they were there in the original, but does that need to be perhaps addressed in the sense that either they should be put in or that section, that notification taken out?
Yeah, no, they should be in. So that must be an omission from Bloomsbury. Yeah, we've been.
Yeah, no, because I have to admit I'm one of those people that actually like looking at photographs as well. So yeah. Patrick, you sent me your starting point is 1973, and it sent me off on a journey because in 1973 I was 22, 23 years of age, you know, in our prime, as we say. And I had to think back to 1973, and I said to myself, in 1973, there were no gays in Ireland. Now, what I mean by that is that nobody defined themselves publicly as gay. Everybody was queer. And then when you get to the end of your book, you actually, almost your last sentence, you talk about LGBT and you talk about queer history. And that to me was squaring the circle in that sense of the word. Was that something you were conscious of when you started to approach this subject?
I don't know if it was. I mean, I kind of tried to stick to the terminology that would have been used in the periods in which I'm looking at. And I suppose when I talk about queer history, towards the end, I think of it much more broadly in terms of the different identities and those who didn't perhaps conform to what was considered the norm at the time. You know, and I was trying to look at it beyond the 20-year period my book focuses on, in the sense that, you know, before the 1970s, there obviously would have been individuals who would have engaged in this sort of activity as well, that the terminology mightn't have been there. So I took queer to be kind of something which is much broader, but to recognise that queer individuals have contributed to our society, have existed, and they have, their history needs to be told as well and needs to be part of the 20th century Irish historiography.
Yeah, no, queer was a derogatory term in 1973, whereas the term has now been reclaimed, and now queer is, you know, I openly describe myself as queer, and people in that sense have reclaimed that language, and it's now a term. It's now a term of I won't say endearment, but it's certainly it's not nearly as derogatory as it would have been back in the period you're talking about.
No, absolutely. Now, there will be some from, say, a certain generation that perhaps are still slightly uncomfortable with that term. And I think it comes with what you're speaking about, the fact that when they would have been growing up, it would have been considered quite a derogatory term. But yes, I mean, I suppose a lot happened in the early 1990s to reclaim that word. And, I myself would use it quite often in my work as well, to encompass again broader identities, not just gay and lesbian, just broader identities.
Yeah. Can I ask you, Patrick, because again, I don't want to see one year over another as a signpost. I thought back and I thought to myself, what was I doing in 1973? And in 1973, I was hippie aristocracy, and we were the prominent social movers and shakers in those days. And I also then thought, 1973, there was, well, I suppose if you go back a couple of years before that, there was no sex in Ireland. Sex wasn't something that was discussed, whether it was gay sex, whether it was straight sex, whatever you want to call it. And the reason why I say I use that term, because the way I would look at it is that everybody that pretty much that you talked about that are very prominent, people like Kieran Rose, people like David Norris, people like Edmund Lynch, people that I know quite well. Those of us who were in, shall we say, the psychedelic fraternity, we would have considered them very straight. Whereas, again, talking about expropriating language, straight was not a term of people who weren't gay. Straight was a term of people who didn't take psychedelic drugs. So it's interesting the way that juxtaposition has moved over in a certain way. What's your thoughts on that one, Patrick?
I'm not sure I'm following. So you're
okay. Well, what I'm saying is that probably the modern Irish gay activism came out of the hippie movement rather than the other way around. And I can give you an example of that in the sense that I had a look at the context in which 1973 happened. And to me, the major event culturally that happened in 1973 was the release of the Lou Reed album Transformer. To me, it was that, I've said it to people, to me that was a light bulb moment. I mean, David Bowie had been out the previous year, but that was a light bulb moment. And that changed it, I think, for a great deal of people to say, hold on, this isn't something that's necessarily alien to what we were doing, but it was very much, how could I put it? It was very much part and parcel of the same energy that we were trying to tap into at the time. Were you conscious at the time when you started your research that there was a cultural context rather than just a political context through which a lot of the later activism emerged?
And to some degree, I suppose some of the activists that I would have spoken to would have spoken about those cultural influences as well. But it doesn't feature to a great extent in my book. I was very much focused on the political, particularly what's happening on student campuses, the role of the student movement, and also within the context of what's happening in Northern Ireland as well. Because again, there is a different mixture of individuals involved at that time with very different backgrounds and different interests. So, I didn't go into a whole lot about those cultural influences, but I think you're absolutely right. No doubt they certainly did have tremendous impact on the individuals.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to 1973. If you went to student campuses in 1973, you were much more likely to find a communist than a queer. And I remember it was May Day in 1973. I went to UCD rather than Trinity, but I spent a lot of time in Trinity with people. And on May Day in 1973, everybody was going around, hello, comrade, blah, 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 comrade. And a few of us who were, as we say, more on the anarchist fringe, we got, a bit peeved with this. So instead of calling it May Day, we called it Gay Day. And instead of going around calling each other comrade, we went around calling each other petal. So ever since then, I have, everybody who knows me, I address them as petal, whether they're men, women, you name it. And that all came from May Day 1973. Now you won't get that in queer history, but that's as I say, that's one of those seeds that was sown.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's fascinating, and yeah, I didn't come across many of those stories, but again, I suppose we're limited in some respects as to what's in the archives and what sort of material and who's collecting that material. But again, I think I did use a good few oral histories, and again, they were very, very important as well. But again, this is one of the things I've often tried to say with my book is like it's a start, but there's so much even in those 20 years that I don't even get to cover in the book. There's so much happening.
Yeah. Something that struck me, Patrick, as well, is that when I looked, you alluded to it in your book, and I suspect my memory is slightly different to what other people's memories are. But I can remember we thought it was very radical to go to. There were three big gay bars essentially in Dublin at the time. There was Davy Byrne's, there was Rice's, and there was Bartley Dunn's. Now, I don't know if they ever told you what the colloquialism for Bartley Dunn's was.
I know they referred to it as Bohemian, but I don't know if there was another name.
They usually referred to it. Most Dubliners would have referred to it as Dartley Bums. Which tells you everything you need to know about it. Now, I remember we went up there, and instead of being this, as the book says, a lively, bustling place, I came away thinking it was a sad place. It was dark. It was quite empty. There were maybe half a dozen people, and they all stared at us when we went in there. And we were going up there mainly as an act of solidarity, because it was, if you were seen coming out of there, well, obviously you were one of them, sort of thing. But and the same, whereas Davy Byrne's was the arty crowd. It was the it was the Ulick O'Connors and whatever, and that's the context that I recall, Patrick. I'm not trying to gild the lily or anything like that. In other words, it was quite black and white. It wasn't a Technicolor scene the way it certainly is now, and I don't know whether. The activists that you spoke to are perhaps painting it in a slightly more glamorous picture than it was, because it wasn't a glamorous world to be living in then, despite what we now see.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a fair reflection. I suppose it's quite an individual, experience, I would imagine, and the context is quite important. Some I know would have thought, well, wow, this is a place where I can meet others like myself, and that might have been quite a relief for them. I know, for example, in 1977, the IGRM newsletter, there was a barman there who was finishing up, and there was some felt quite welcome there, and I think that for them was quite important. So I think a lot of it is quite individual. Now, I will say some of the stories that I read from lesbian women who went there, they would have probably shared similar views that it was, there was a lot of gay men and very few lesbian women, So for them, it wouldn't have been a space maybe that would have been as enjoyable as others found. But again, I suppose it's an individual experience.
Yeah, well, you do refer to that because very much the place that became the women's venue was J.J. Smith's, and they still talk about, particularly the women I speak to, they still talk about J.J. Smith's reverentially. And sadly, that hasn't got a plaque, which I've been trying to get people in Dublin City Council to take on board. On that point then, Patrick, it's very much a book about gay men. Would you agree on that one, that women, I won't say they're secondary, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of synergy between what we would call lesbian aspirations or female aspirations, for want of a better term, and gay men's aspirations. Is that a perspective you would take on board?
I made a conscious effort to ensure that lesbian women were part of the story, and I do think they feature quite a bit in the book. Now, obviously, people can disagree. Again, there certainly was divisions, but there's also stories of women and men working together during this time. And yes, tensions existed, but there was also tension between gay men as well. I mean, if you take, for example, activists or organisations in Dublin and Cork, there was tension there, and even within organisations in Dublin. So I think you'll get that. But, you know, I think women were part of the campaign to decriminalise same-sex sexual activity in men. You know, you'd see they were making recommendations to the Council for the Status of Women, Liberation for Irish Lesbians and the National Gay Federation. They worked together as well to some degree. Now there was still tension. So, I mean, there are certainly examples of lesbian women and gay men certainly working together, but tensions that exist, but that will be common, you know, in other countries as well. But I was conscious that I did want the stories of lesbian women to feature in this book as well.
Yeah, I should make it clear. I left Ireland in 1974, and I didn't return here for the first time really until 1992. So almost I'm outside for the entirety of the period you cover. However, I was in contact with people here, and I was very much in contact with what I would call the diaspora, and that's something that I found very interesting, particularly when I went to Australia. Is that it wasn't a big thing. It wasn't a thing in Ireland when I was here to say, hello, I'm gay, homosexual, queer, whatever you want. However, once they got to Australia, and we're talking about 1980 to 82, 3 here, the number of Irish people who came to Australia and suddenly, yep, not only are we gay, but we're in your we're in your face gay. It was a revelation in that sense of the word. It was like we can now be ourselves. Perhaps there's another book there for you on the diaspora, but it suggests that there was a great deal of, if you like, suppressed emotion amongst LGBTQ plus people in this country. Is that something that came through with your research?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, anybody really in Irish society who didn't conform expectations at that time, you know, it wasn't a very welcoming country. I mean, we only have to look at the way we treated unmarried mothers. So absolutely, there's no doubt had and society's attitude towards that did have a tremendous impact on them, and they did, you know, no doubt leave the country as a result of that. But like there are others in as well where, you know, and we should also agency of a lot of people who were here as well, and how they created us for individuals to meet others. And powerful story as well, that they, you know, that they fought back against the state's treatment, and they created a space for individuals to meet. And you know, if you pick up and you read about the gay nightclub in the Hirschfield Centre, Flickers, you know, you hear some quite positive enjoyment as well. And we shouldn't forget some of those stories as well. Like, you know, there was a lot of people going to Flickers Friday, Saturday and Sunday night. And I think there's something quite powerful in those stories as well that we often overlook. But not obviously trying to you know, dismiss the idea that it was a very difficult time, but, you know, people did create a space. And, you know, if you listen to Tony Walsh sometimes, and the Hirschfield Centre, for example, it seemed like a really great place.
Well, it's interesting. No, I've discussed certain things. I think Tony is one of the great icons of that era. He probably would slap me for saying he's an icon. That Tony's energy and Tony's enthusiasm is just something special. I don't know if you ever saw his play. This is Tony Walsh. It was look, it was just remarkable. But something that struck me, and I don't want to labour this point to Patrick, when I looked back and I said to and I've discussed this with a couple of other people in the last few days, I said, if you were to ask people in 1973, 74 or thereabouts, which was most likely to be legalized first, would it be homosexual activities or marijuana? Most people overwhelmingly would have said marijuana. Now, it wasn't, and it's still illegal, and it's still even taboo to a certain degree. Why do you think that? Was it? Would you put that down entirely to activism, or do you think there were other factors that may have played into it? Because, and I'll give you my thoughts on that in a second.
Well, I suppose activism was certainly a key role, but a lot of it, I think, is to do with the personal. And I suppose the more people that became comfortable with their sexuality and came out to friends and family, it normalized it as such. But back in 1993, there's nothing to suggest that society was absolutely happy with decriminalization. Polls would say otherwise. But when you look at other events, you might say, okay, well, maybe society wasn't, or at that time anyways, wasn't so against gay and lesbian individuals. But I do think a lot of it is these personal stories, and coming out to family and friends certainly had a big role to play, and it's getting to that point where people, the likes of Joni Crone, going on the Late Late Show and telling about her story, and people putting a face to these individuals, I think certainly did have a big impact and change in people's perceptions of what they had been told. And you'll see that in some of the people that contact the Late Late Show after Joni Crone, it goes on that, she seems like a decent individual. So I think these stories were really important as well, along with the activism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't met Joni Crone until about 2 years ago when they were putting the plaque for the Hirschfield Centre. And I had watched the interview, and again, and I think there's a much more nuanced take on that. Is that I've never watched the Late Late Show after watching that interview because of Gay Byrne's hideous remark when he said to her, "What would your mother think?" And the way she was attacked by the audience as well. And I thought, that's the Ireland that I was happy to leave. But she said something very, very positive, which I thought was brilliant. She was working somewhere at the time, and the boss took her in on the Monday after the Late Late Show, and he said, if anybody gives you any grief or anything like that, come and tell me about it. And that, I think, was very important, was the development of alliances, development, not necessarily development within gay people, but development of people who weren't and who were empathetic towards people's circumstance. And she's one of the most remarkable people you'll ever come across, Johnny. I mean, her courage was incredible. But again, and it doesn't quite come out in the book. What she said at the time, the reason why she went on there was not so much to say, hello, I'm lesbian, but they were about to start a lesbian helpline, and they wanted to publicize the lesbian helpline. And that's the reason why she went on there, was to bring that to the attention, not her own personal circumstance, but the fact that she wanted to make that other people out there aware. And she did that at quite a personal sacrifice.
I mean, there would have been, Tell a Friend would have been around for a while. Now, I'm not saying that's why she didn't go on, but I mean, the material I found, that's why Joni went on, was to create awareness, because again, there was such a lack of awareness or understanding of women at that time. I don't recall if the helpline was mentioned on the interview now again, but that's certainly possible. But a lot of it, from what my research was, she did want to talk about lesbian women in Ireland, and she says that, if memory serves me right, in the interview. But
yeah. Well, I think it was might been 2, maybe 3 years ago at Dublin Pride, I came across another person who's mentioned in your book, and that's Mary Dorsey. And Mary read out a poem that she had written, and I didn't really know Mary up to that point in time, and I just stood looking at this woman, and I was absolutely mesmerized. I thought, oh my God, what a force of nature this woman is. Well, and I thought, then I realised she's older than me. And when you realise, when you see somebody like that, particularly now they're now in their 70s, you realise the energy that these people must have had when they were in their 20s and 30s must have been phenomenal. The self-belief. And I think that to me is what drives the activism. Because it wasn't, it was a bit like trying to wade through a swamp in lead boots to try and change Ireland in those days. And that to me is, you've done a great job of trying to, shall we say, define that landscape. But it's when you meet these people, even now, they are still phenomenal.
Absolutely. I think Mary Dorsey, she was interviewed by Edmund Lynch a few years ago, and one of the phrases she said, she was on about the first symposium on homosexuality, which was organised in Trinity College Dublin in February 1974, and she was like, we came out of a country that was like Stalinist Russia, and it was just such a great way of putting what Ireland was like at that time, so repressive.
Very much so. The chapter I found the most interesting, perhaps because I wasn't here, was when you said Ireland wasn't very well organized, very well set up to deal with the AIDS crisis. How did you were probably more aware of that because of your age, Patrick, but I had been in Australia when HIV/AIDS came along, and I was struck very much by the difference, the way they approached it over there as opposed to the way they approached it here. And the way they approached it there was essentially what I describe as Australians accepted that people will sin and we mightn't like it, but we're going to make it safe. Whereas Ireland took the approach, we'll try and stop them sinning. How does that analogy sit with you?
I mean, you're right in the money. I'm not familiar with the Australian context, but that's exactly what it was in Ireland. There was a lack of reality almost. It was just, let's just ignore that people are going to have sex. Let's just pretend it doesn't happen. But we'll just tell them, to either get married and stay faithful to that one partner. If you're not married, to just abstain from sex altogether. So with that, it was left, like in many other countries, to the gay community to get the information, to get accurate and explicit information out to not only the gay community, but to the wider community as well. And, it's one of the things that most struck me during my research is the work of Gay Health Action, what they did in the late 1980s. And I think, as a country, we owe them a debt of gratitude for what
Absolutely.
they did. Like, it's their resilience and what they were able to do with such limited resources, all voluntary. It's just, I just was taken aback by it really, and they got so little support from the state. Now someone will say, oh yeah, they got £750 for one leaflet, but that was pittance compared to what they were doing. And I think there's no doubt that they saved many lives through their educational campaigns.
No, one of the fundamental differences I noticed at that period, because it was quite strange, as you can appreciate. Nobody really knew what was happening, and there was a great deal of fear. But in Australia, when HIV/AIDS was identified, and there was all that gay plague stuff and all the religious fundamentalists, but very early in the piece, particularly in what we will call the gay area, because there was very much an entertainment area there that wasn't to the same degree here. You could go there, you could go through there on a Saturday night, and there would be the equivalent of one of those fish and chip vans, and they would hand out condoms and they would hand out clean syringes. Now that was from 84, 85. Now, I think it was 6 or 7 years afterwards before we might have gone down that. And that's what I mean by the difference is that we mightn't like what you do, we're going to try our best to make it safe. And I think that's the mindset. To me, these are the important mindsets that the LGBT plus community engendered in Irish society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, back in Ireland at that time, it was, you know, there was still legislation restricting access to condoms, you know. The government was so reluctant to even mention the word condom in their campaign. So again, it was all down to the gay community getting these leaflets out there and getting access to condoms. But, you know, that's the context, you know, the church still had quite considerable influence in 1980 Ireland, you know, and you can see that in the government's campaign, you know, it's about chastity and fidelity, which was
Just on
scandalous.
that note, Patrick, I noticed when they did eventually set up, I think it was an AIDS working party or a task force or something like that. It was initially the Catholic Church was very heavily involved, and I thought to myself reading that is it because tacitly that they recognised they have quite a lot of vulnerable people in their ranks who may somehow. Clearly, it would have been a catastrophe if all these priests suddenly have to be contracting HIV.
I don't know. I mean, I think it was just my own sense is that it was just a reflection of the fact that the government was still very much conscious of the Roman Catholic Church and believed that it had a role to play in this, and you know they were willing to fund some of the activities that they organised. But then, you know, I mean, when you think about it, in 1985, the government is exploring the possibility of using AIDS as a defence against the laws. You know, so like that's the mindset of the government at that time. And even when it was made quite clear to them that, you know, rather than helping prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS, that the laws might actually make the situation worse, they still waited 8 years to amend the legislation, you know. So, and really it's not until you see an increase in the number of heterosexuals contracting HIV that the government really says, oh, hang on a second, we must think about doing something here, you know. And it's the same, I think Randy Schiltz says it in his book as well. You know, it's not until it was outside the gay community that people started contracting HIV that the government started to do even just the bare minimum, you know.
Yeah. Now, I may be wrong about this, but I can recall, and I think I came back here in 1992. Now, I hadn't been here for about 15, 16 years at that stage. So I was very familiar with HIV within the community, the treatment and so on. And my father was ill in Beaumont, and two things that struck me is that the so-called AIDS ward, it was about as far away from the main hospital as you could get. I believe they were still burying people in body bags. But the other bit that I found very interesting is that Ireland, compared to elsewhere, had more people who were not gay who were HIV positive, usually intravenous drug users because of the issues that we had. Is that something that came across in your research, or am I perhaps getting an anecdote confused there, Patrick?
No, you're right. I mean, it was IV drug users who did account for the higher percentage of cases. But then again, like, and I think there's a lot more research to be done here. You'd hear anecdotally how, you know, a lot of gay men just left the country, you know, and they went to unfortunately die abroad. And I think London, there was quite a big community of Irish gay men who unfortunately died during that period as a result of AIDS related illnesses. I think there's a body of research to be done on that as well. Again, I suppose there was the stigma, right? There was such a stigma associated with it.
Yeah, I know you need to get away, Patrick, but I interviewed David Norris for the 10th anniversary of decriminalisation, and he was very interesting on the subject because, as we know, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in 1988 that Ireland was in breach of its obligations, but it took another 5 years before they actually, shall we say, met those obligations. In many respects, you could argue that 5-year period pretty much was the culmination of what had gone on for the previous 15 years before that. In other words, that this was the essential. The energy had come together, but this was the essential. One more push, and we'll get there. Is that how you interpreted that period? Because it was quite it was quite an energetic period, and it was also quite a diverse period in the sense that there was a lot more allies around than there was just LGBTQ plus people.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, you know, from the establishment of the Irish gay rights movement in 1974, activists were quite conscious that they needed to go beyond the gay community. They needed the support of other influential organizations in Irish society if they were to bring about change as such. So by the time we're coming to 1988, you know, you have the Irish Congress of Trade Unions is very much in support of amending legislation, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, the Students' Union, and you have a handful of politicians as well at that stage. And I think one great politician was Noel Brown. He was extremely supportive from day one. So yeah, so as you're coming in then to the beginning of the 1990s, you know, you have a lot of these other organizations making the case not only for decriminalization, but for an equal age of consent for both homosexual and heterosexual sexual activity. And that's what was quite different about decriminalization in Ireland as opposed to England and Wales, where there was an equal age of consent. So when Ireland did decriminalise in 1993, it was considered quite progressive because there was an equal age of consent. But I do think the fact that, you know, there were so many other organisations coming out in support and calling for decriminalisation did make, I think, a big difference as well at that time. And again, it's a reflection of the work of activists throughout Ireland, reaching out to these other organisations to get them to recognise that at that time gay rights was a human rights issue.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you should mention Noel Brown, because he was always the great political influence as I was growing up. And the day after we passed the divorce referendum, which was I think 1996, I rang up Noel, and he took my phone call. It was incredible, and the warmth of the man would have moved anybody, I would suggest, because I was saying to him, you must feel vindicated now. There was no sense of bitterness. There was no sense of triumphalism. It was essentially, it was a vindication. And that's exactly what I said to him. I said, no, you must feel vindicated. And I think he died a happy man a few months after that. And in many respects, I think that's the great legacy of what you've talked about in your book. Eventually, in 2015, we changed the world. Subsequently, we brought in gender recognition, and then we changed the Eighth Amendment, and it was done without a sense of triumphalism. It was done with a sense of historical inevitability, and I think that's the great tribute to all those activists that you discuss within the book. How do you feel about that, Patrick?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I think a lot of the changes that have happened in the recent years, you have to look at the longer history, and that's one of the points I make with this book. You know, marriage equality didn't happen overnight. You know, this is all, there's a lot of work that has been building up to this over the years. You know, it's not just since civil partnership, but a lot of the alliances, a lot of the stories, a lot of the connections, you know, it goes back to the start of the gay rights movement in Ireland. You know, there's obviously been challenges between them, but we need to put that within its wider historical context and to recognise that, you know, because of these individuals and their activities, Ireland is a better society today. It's a better place. It's a more inclusive place for people. And we need to recognise that. And it's one of the reasons I suppose I was interested in this topic, is because so much of Irish history is very much focused on high politics, and we often overlook the grassroots activists and the role that they've played as well. And we often just give politicians praise for change, when in reality, it's the grassroots efforts of individuals who have really made a difference here.
Yeah. Last but by no means least, Patrick, the book is called Gay and Lesbian Activism in the Republic of Ireland, 1973 to 1993. Where can people get a copy? And particularly for those who would like to give it as Christmas presents, how can they get a copy and how can they order a copy?
So they can go on to bloomsbury.com and if they enter in a code activism21UK, they can get 35% off. They can also reach out to me directly as well, patrick.mcdonagh@eui.eu, and I can help them get a copy as well.
Are you still selling copies at Winter Pride?
There's only a few left, and they were just really
they're
discounted.
all snapped up. Look, I can't recommend it too highly to people. It's a great read. It's full of information. It's also a great reference work as well, which I think is a tribute to. It's something that appeals greatly to somebody like me. It's incredibly well referenced. It's your sources are there. It's got a terrific index, so I can't speak too highly of it, Patrick. You're to be congratulated, and the title of doctor is well earned and well deserved.
Thanks very much. You're very kind.
Friends of Dorothy come out off the sidewalk and onto the street to the sound of those legendary feet. When there's no place like home, anti-establishment, with the chaff and the short straw, they'll have a stuff for sure. Anti-M, I'm anti-establishment. They took my name and the clothes I own. They broke our hearts, but not our souls. When there's no place like home, when there's no place like home, when there's no place like home.